Fort Claymore operated like a Swiss watch. Every morning at 0600, rows of boots struck pavement in perfect unison. The air filled with the bark of drill sergeants and the burn of discipline that shaped boys into soldiers. Everything and everyone had their place in this machine of military precision. Everyone except Diana Carson. She wasn't listed on any roster. She didn't report to any unit. Her name tag simply read D. Carson, and she pushed a mop down the corridors at night, hauling trash bins when the base slept. The young recruits had given her nicknames: Ghost, Janitor, Granny. Or sometimes just Ma'am, with the kind of smirk that said they didn't mean it. Diana never reacted. Not to the whispers, not to the snickers when she passed by in that same olive drab field jacket. Old school cut, Vietnam era. Its colors washed out, but the stitching still sharp. They said she wore it because she couldn't afford new clothes. They said she lived in the abandoned storage barracks behind the hangars, even though no one had keys to those anymore. They said a lot of things, but they never asked her anything directly. The morning everything changed. Started like any other. Diana was cleaning the firing range hallway when the new batch of recruits came through fresh from basic, cocky from marksmanship scores and push-up contests. They looked at her like she was part of the furniture. Recruit Marcus Reyes saw her, wringing out her mop, and said just loud enough, "You think she even knows what a rifle looks like?" Laughter followed. Another recruit, Tommy Bradford, added, "Bet that jacket's seen more mops than combat. Probably a museum piece." "Yeah, she." "Is the museum?" Someone else chimed in. Diana heard all of it. Said nothing. Just wrung the mop and moved on. Her weathered hands steady despite the tremor that had started appearing in her left fingers. A reminder of something the recruits would never understand. Later that evening, they saw her walking across the tarmac. Alone, wind kicking up her jacket slightly. The way it hung heavy and straight, like it belonged to someone who had once stood taller than she looked now. The patch on her left sleeve, an eagle gripping a sword through lightning, wasn't current regulation. Not anymore. "Is that even real?" one asked. "Looks homemade." "Looks fake," another replied. They laughed again, but something in the way she carried herself made a few of them stop mid-chuckle. There was something in her posture, something that didn't match the bent woman with the mop bucket. For just a moment, she looked like she was marching to a drumbeat they couldn't hear. That night during mess, she sat in the far corner of the cafeteria, tray barely touched, eyes fixed on something distant. She never spoke, never took a phone out, never nodded hello to anyone. She simply sat still, like a stone buried beneath time, and every new class of recruits followed the same cycle: curiosity, mockery, dismissal. Until Thursday morning changed everything. It was inspection day, and the entire base held its breath. General Marcus Mason, commander of base operations, was known for three things: his photographic memory, his zero-tolerance policy for disrespect, and his ability to spot a faker from 50 yards away. When he stepped onto the courtyard that Thursday morning, flanked by aides and officers, the entire formation of recruits snapped to attention with the precision of a rifle bolt. The courtyard fell silent, that particular kind of military silence that vibrated with nervous energy and barely contained fear. Every boot was polished to mirror shine, every uniform pressed to razor creases. This was the inspection that could make or break a recruit standing. At the far end of the formation, by the storage corridor, Diana passed by with her wheeled trash bin. She moved with the same quiet efficiency as always, invisible to the pomp and ceremony unfolding in the courtyard. Just another piece of base maintenance beneath the notice of the important proceedings. General Mason was halfway through inspecting the front row when he stopped mid-stride. His aides faltered, expecting him to continue down the line, but his Eyes had locked onto something that made his blood run cold. That jacket. More precisely, that patch. His brow furrowed as memories cascaded back classified briefings. Sealed files, names that were never supposed to be spoken aloud. The Phoenix. Unit. Operation Shadowfall. The mission that officially never happened. Sir? One of his aides whispered, confused by the sudden halt. Mason didn't answer. He broke formation, walked directly across the field toward the woman with the trash bin. Every eye in the courtyard followed him, confusion rippling through the ranks. Generals didn't break inspection protocol. Not ever. Diana paused when she saw him approaching, looked up slowly. The silence in the courtyard became absolute. You could hear the distant rumble of jets on the runway, the flutter of the flag in the morning breeze. The general stopped in front of her, studied her face, then looked down at the patch on her jacket. When he spoke, his voice was soft, but in the morning stillness, it carried. You wore that in Cuner Province. It wasn't a question. Diana nodded once, her expression unreadable. General Mason exhaled, the sound carrying the weight of buried secrets and forgotten wars. Then he straightened and did something that would be talked about on base for years to come. He saluted her. Not a casual salute, not a gesture of politeness, but a full military salute with the solemnity soldiers reserved for fallen heroes. The recruits froze. One dropped his water bottle, the plastic clattering on the concrete. No one moved. No one blinked. Mason turned slowly to face the entire courtyard, his voice carrying with the authority of absolute truth. This woman fought in places most of you have only seen on classified maps. That patch, that's the Phoenix unit. 10 went in, 3 came out. She was one of them. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. The silence stretched until it became uncomfortable, heavy, with the weight of realization. Every joke, every whispered comment, every smirk suddenly felt like sacrilege. For the first time since anyone could remember, Diana smiled. Just barely, just enough to be seen. Then she turned and walked away, pushing her cart toward the supply building. The recruits stood frozen, watching her retreating figure with new eyes. The woman they had dismissed as invisible suddenly seemed larger than life, carrying secrets that could fill volumes of classified documents. As the morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the courtyard, whispers began to spread through Fort Claymore like wildfire. But this time, no one was laughing. The change was immediate and uncomfortable. Where once the hallways buzzed with casual conversation, now they fell silent when Diana appeared. The recruits who had joked about her jacket now stepped aside with awkward politeness, their eyes following her with a mixture of shame and curiosity. But human nature abhors a vacuum, and the absence of mockery was quickly filled with something far more dangerous. Questions. Lieutenant Jake Harrison, fresh out of West Point, with more ambition than wisdom, decided he would be the one to solve the mystery. During his off-duty hours, he haunted the base records office, digging through personnel files and archived documents with the determination of a man convinced he was on the verge of a major discovery. "There's nothing here," he muttered to Sergeant Patricia Wells, the records keeper. "No enlistment file, no service record, no medical history. It's like she doesn't exist." Wells, a 20-year veteran who had seen officers like Harrison come and go, barely looked up from her computer. Maybe she doesn't want to exist. Ever think of that? But General Mason saluted her, in front of the entire base. "You don't do that for ghosts. Maybe ghosts are exactly who you salute for." Harrison wasn't satisfied with cryptic responses. He pulled strings, called in favors, even reached out to his father's connections in the Pentagon. What he found made him wish he had listened to Sergeant Wells. The Phoenix unit did exist, buried so deep in classified archives that accessing the files required clearance levels Harrison would never achieve. What little he could piece together painted a picture of an elite reconnaissance unit that operated in the gray areas where conventional military doctrine feared to tread. Operation Shadowfall, Kunar Province, Afghanistan. A mission so classified that even its failure was classified. The official reports were sealed, but the whispers spoke of an extraction gone wrong, of a team that walked into hell and fought their way back out, leaving most of their number behind. The more Harrison dug, the more doors slammed shut in his face. Phone calls went unreturned. Emails disappeared into digital black holes. And finally, a visit from two men in suits who politely but firmly suggested he find a new hobby. Meanwhile, Diana continued her routine as if nothing had changed. Same corridors, same schedule, same quiet efficiency. But now the base watched her differently. The recruits who once saw a tired old woman now noticed the way she moved, economical, precise, like someone who had learned that wasted motion could mean the difference between life and death. Marcus Reyes, the recruit who had first mocked a knowledge of rifles, found himself studying her during evening mess. There was something in the way she held her shoulders, the way her eyes constantly scanned the room, cataloging exits and potential threats with the unconscious habit of someone who had survived by being perpetually alert. "She's reading the room," he whispered to his bunkmate. "Look at her. She's not just sitting there. She's working." The observation spread through the recruit barracks like a virus. Soon, everyone was watching Diana with the fascination usually reserved for dangerous animals at the zoo. They began to notice things they had missed before. The slight callus on her trigger finger, the faint scar that ran from her left ear to her jawline, the way she moved through crowds without ever putting her back to an open door. But it was Tommy Bradford who made the discovery that changed everything. He was on night duty, emptying trash bins around the administration building, when he saw light spilling from under the door of the old communications room, a space that had been officially decommissioned years ago. Curious, he peered through the dusty window and saw Diana inside, not cleaning, but working with equipment that shouldn't have been there. Radio equipment, satellite communication gear, hardware that looked far too sophisticated for a military base custodian to operate, let alone understand. She was speaking quietly into a headset, her voice carrying the crisp efficiency of someone giving a situation report. Bradford couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, professional, military, urgent. When she finished and began shutting down the equipment, Bradford ducked away from the window, his heart pounding. He had stumbled onto something big, something that made General Mason's salute seem like just the tip of a very deep iceberg. The next morning, Bradford shared his discovery with his squad, and the whispers began anew. But this time, they carried a different tone. Fear was creeping in, mixing with the curiosity and shame. If Diana Carson was still operational, still connected to whatever shadowy world the Phoenix unit inhabited, then she wasn't just a decorated veteran deserving respect. She was someone who could disappear you. The news of Bradford's discovery spread through the barracks like smoke through a ventilation system. By morning formation, every recruit in Charlie Company knew that the woman they had been mocking was doing more than just cleaning floors. Reyes couldn't concentrate during weapons training. His shots were off, his timing sloppy. When Drill Sergeant Williams called him out for his poor performance, he wanted to explain, to share what Bradford had seen, but something held him back. Some instinct that whispered this was bigger than barracks gossip. During lunch, he made his decision. Instead of heading to the mess hall, he sought out Lieutenant Harrison, finding him in the officers' lounge nursing a cup of coffee and staring at a stack of redacted documents. "Sir, we need to talk," Reyes said, his voice barely above a whisper. Harrison looked up, noted the tension in the young recruit's posture, and gestured to an empty chair. "What's on your mind, soldier?" Reyes glanced around to ensure they were alone, then leaned forward. "It's about Carson, sir. The custodian. We think she's still active." Harrison's coffee cup paused halfway to his lips. "What do you mean, active?" "Bradford saw her last night, in the old cum room. She was using equipment that shouldn't be there, talking to someone. It looked like she was giving a mission report." The color drained from Harrison's face. The pieces of his investigation suddenly clicked into place with terrifying clarity. The missing service records, the classified files, the men in suits who had warned him off it all made sense if Diana Carson wasn't retired military, if she was still working. "Jesus," he breathed. "She's not a veteran. She's current ops." "Sir?" Harrison stood abruptly, knocking over his chair. "Don't repeat what you just told me to anyone else. Do you understand? Not to your buddies, not to your squad leader, not to anyone. But sir, that's an order, Reyes, and tell Bradford to keep his mouth shut too." But Harrison's warning came too late. The story had already taken on a life of its own, growing and mutating as it passed from mouth to mouth. By evening, the base believed Diana Carson was a deep cover operative, and the other half thought she was a government assassin hiding in plain sight. The truth, as it often does, fell somewhere in between. Diana felt the shift in the atmosphere around her, like a change in barometric pressure before a storm. The respectful distance that had replaced mockery was now tinged with something else: fear, suspicion, and the kind of nervous energy that made people do stupid things. She had dealt with similar situations before, in other places, under other identities. The solution was always the same: disappear before the attention became problematic. She had already begun making arrangements, packing the few possessions that mattered, preparing for another relocation to another base where she could blend into the background for another few years. But Fort Claymore was different. This was supposed to be her last assignment, the place where she could finally stop running from ghosts that refused to stay buried. She was tired of disappearing, tired of being no one, tired of carrying secrets that grew heavier with each passing year. That evening, as she made her final rounds through the administration building, she found Lieutenant Harrison waiting for her in the main corridor. He stood at attention, his face pale but determined. "Ma'am," he said formally. "I need to apologize." Diana stopped, studied his face. "For what, Lieutenant?" "I've been digging into your background, making inquiries. I know I shouldn't have, but I couldn't help myself. And now the whole base is talking, and it's my fault." She considered this for a long moment, then smiled slightly. "You're not the first curious officer I've encountered, Lieutenant. Probably won't be the last. The thing is, ma'am, I think you should know. There are people getting nervous. Important people. The kind who don't like loose ends." Diana's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her posture, a subtle alertness that reminded Harrison of a cat hearing a distant sound. "Thank you for the warning," she said quietly. "It's appreciated." She turned to leave, then paused. "Lieutenant, the next time you get curious about classified operations, remember that some secrets are classified for good reasons. And sometimes the people carrying those secrets are the ones standing between you and the things that would keep you awake at night." As she walked away, Harrison realized that his investigation had been more than just inappropriate. It had been dangerous. Not just for Diana Carson, but for everyone who had gotten too close to whatever truth she represented. The game was about to change, and he had a sinking feeling that they were all about to learn the difference between playing at being soldiers and actually being in the fight. The black SUV arrived at Fort Claymore at 0500 2 hours before Reveille. It bypassed the main gate entirely, using a service entrance that most of the base personnel didn't know existed. The three men who emerged wore civilian clothes but moved with the unmistakable bearing of military officers. the kind who dealt with problems that didn't appear on official reports. Colonel James Mitchell, the base commander, met them at his office before dawn. The conversation was brief and one-sided. By the time the morning formation began, new orders had been issued through the chain of command. Diana Carson was to report to the administration building immediately following her shift. No explanation was provided, but the tension in the officers' voices made it clear that this wasn't a routine meeting. Word spread through the barracks faster than the official notice. The recruits who had been watching Diana with curious fascination now felt a collective guilt settling over them like a heavy blanket. Whatever was happening, it was their fault. Their questions, their gossip, their inability to leave well enough alone had brought attention to a woman who had clearly spent years trying to avoid exactly this kind of scrutiny. Reyes found himself unable to eat breakfast, his stomach twisted into knots. He had been the one to involve Lieutenant Harrison, had been part of the chain of events that led to this moment. When he saw Diana making her usual rounds, seemingly unaware of the storm gathering around her, he wanted to warn her, to somehow make amends for his role in whatever was about to happen. But Diana knew. She had been expecting this moment for 3 years, ever since she had first arrived at Fort Claymore and settled into the comfortable anonymity of being invisible. The truth was that she had always been living on borrowed time, and that time had finally run out. At 1400 hours, she knocked on the door of Conference Room C in the administration building. When she entered, she found herself facing 4 men she didn't recognize, but whose credentials she could read in their posture, their watchful eyes, and the way they had positioned themselves around the room to control all the exits. Diana Carson, the lead man said. It wasn't a question. Or should I say, Staff Sergeant Alexandria Cross, formerly of the 10th Special Operations Unit, Phoenix Division? Diana remained standing, her hands at her sides. I prefer Carson these days. I'm sure you do. Please sit. She remained standing. I'm fine here. The man, clearly the leader, consulted a tablet. You've been at Fort Claymore for 3 years, working as custodial services. No security clearance on file. No background check beyond basic civilian employment screening. Very clever. I mopped floors and emptied trash cans. I wasn't aware that required a security clearance. Cut the act, Cross. We know about the communication equipment in the old cum room. We know about your regular contact with your handler. We know you've been using this base as a cover for continued operations. Diana's expression didn't change, but Lieutenant Harrison, who had been called in as a witness, saw something flicker in her eyes. Not fear, but calculation. She was assessing the room, the men, the situation, running through options with the speed of someone who had made similar assessments under far more dangerous circumstances. I clean that room once a week, she said calmly. If there's equipment there that shouldn't be, perhaps you should investigate your security protocols. The lead interrogator smiled without warmth. We've been very patient with you, Cross. The Phoenix unit was disbanded. Operation Shadowfall was closed. You were supposed to be debriefed and discharged. Instead, you vanished from a military hospital in Germany and surfaced 3 years later as a civilian custodian. That's not retirement. That's desertion. I was medically discharged. The paperwork should be in your files. The paperwork was fabricated. Very well done, but fabricated nonetheless. You've been off the grid for 6 years, Cross. Living under false identities, moving from base to base, maintaining contact with elements that officially don't exist. That makes you either a rogue operative or a security threat. Harrison watched the exchange with growing unease. This wasn't a routine debriefing, it was an interrogation. And these men were treating Diana like a hostile asset rather than a decorated veteran. Something was very wrong with this picture. Which brings us to the question, The man continued, "Of what exactly you've been doing for the past 3 years. Who you've been talking to. What intelligence you've been gathering." Diana finally smiled, and Harrison felt a chill run down his spine. It wasn't a friendly expression. "I've been taking out the trash," she said quietly. "Someone has to clean up the messes that people like you leave behind." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. The lead interrogator leaned forward, his professional demeanor cracking slightly. "Are you going to cooperate with this investigation? Or do we need to take this conversation somewhere less comfortable?" Diana looked at each man in turn, her gaze lingering just long enough to make them uncomfortable. When she spoke, her voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had stared death in the face and won. "I think, gentlemen, that you're operating under some significant misconceptions about who has authority over whom in this situation." She reached into her jacket pocket, and every man in the room tensed. What she withdrew wasn't a weapon. It was a cell phone, an encrypted military device that shouldn't have been in the possession of a civilian custodian. "I think it's time you spoke to my actual commanding officer." Diana placed the encrypted phone on the conference table and dialed a number from memory. The lead interrogator, Agent Reynolds, tried to object, but she held up a hand with the kind of authority that made him instinctively freeze. "This is Carson. Authentication code Phoenix 77 Alpha." Her voice was crisp, professional, the voice of someone giving a situation report. "I ain't to speak to control. Priority 1. The room fell silent. Even the ambient noise from the base's daily operations seemed to fade as everyone strained to hear the conversation. Reynolds reached for the phone, but Diana's cold stare stopped him mid-motion. "Yes, sir. I understand. Fort Claymore, conference room C4, unknown agents, 1 Lieutenant Harrison." She paused, listening. Confirmed. "They have badges but no authentication codes. They're claiming Phoenix unit was disbanded and that I'm operating without authorization." Lieutenant Harrison watched the blood drain from Reynolds' face as Diana continued the conversation. Whatever voice was on the other end of that call carried enough weight to make a federal agent sweat. "Understood, sir. I'll wait for your call." She hung up and returned the phone to her pocket. "Gentlemen, I suggest we all remain calm and wait for clarification." Reynolds tried to regain control of the situation. "I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but..." The conference room phone rang, cutting him off. The base landline, not Diana's encrypted device. Reynolds looked confused, then angry. "Don't answer that," he ordered Harrison. Diana reached for the phone herself. "Conference room C. Carson speaking." She listened for a moment, then held out the handset to Reynolds. "It's for you." Reynolds took the phone with obvious reluctance, his face cycling through confusion, surprise, and finally, undisguised fear. The conversation was brief and one-sided. He mostly said, "Yes, sir," and "Understood, sir," while his complexion grew paler. When he hung up, the dynamic in the room had shifted completely. The other 3 agents were watching him with the kind of attention subordinates paid to a superior who had just received very bad news. "There's been a misunderstanding," Reynolds said, his voice carefully controlled. "We were operating under incomplete information." Diana nodded calmly. "It happens. Bureaucracy can be confusing, especially when you're working with compartmentalized information. Our briefing indicated that Phoenix unit was disbanded following Operation Shadowfall." Phoenix unit was reorganized following Operation Shadowfall. Some operations are too important to abandon simply because they become difficult. Harrison was trying to follow the conversation, but it felt like listening to people speak in code. What he did understand was that Diana Carson or Alexandria Cross, or whoever she really was, had just made 4 federal agents back down with a single phone call. Reynolds cleared his throat. "We'll need to verify some details with our superiors." "Of course." I'm sure they'll be happy to explain the situation. Just remember, gentlemen, some operations require deep cover, even from other agencies. Especially from other agencies. The agents filed out of the room without another word, leaving Harrison alone with Diana. The silence stretched uncomfortably as he tried to process what he had just witnessed. "Ma'am," he finally said, "I think I owe you more than an apology." Diana was back to being the quiet custodian, but now Harrison could see it for what it really was: camouflage, carefully maintained to hide someone whose true identity was far more complex than anyone had imagined. "You were doing your job, Lieutenant. Asking questions, staying alert. That's what good officers do, but I put you at risk. All that digging, all those inquiries, were noticed by exactly the people who were supposed to notice them. Do you think it's an accident that you were able to access the information you found? That your questions reached the right ears at the right time?" Harrison stared at her as the implication sank in. "You wanted to be discovered. I needed to know who was watching, who was asking questions, and who they were reporting to. Your investigation served as an excellent test of base security protocols." She smiled slightly. "Though I admit it also served its purpose in other ways." "What other ways?" Diana moved toward the door, then paused. "Sometimes, Lieutenant, the best way to maintain deep cover is to let people think they've blown your cover. It tends to make them stop looking for the real secrets." As she left the room, Harrison realized that everything he thought he understood about the past few days had been wrong. Diana Carson hadn't been exposed by their investigation. She had orchestrated it. But the question remained, if that had all been theater, what was the real operation? And more importantly, what was she really doing at Fort Claymore? The next morning brought an unusual announcement over the base's PA system. All personnel were to report to the main briefing hall at 1,000 hours for a special presentation. No exceptions, no excuses. The tone of the announcement made it clear that this wasn't a routine briefing. The hall buzzed with nervous energy as soldiers filed in. The events of the previous day had spread through the base grapevine, and everyone knew that somehow their quiet custodian was at the center of whatever was happening. Diana entered through a side door, but she wasn't wearing her custodial uniform. Instead, she wore crisp military fatigues with insignia that made several officers do double takes. Staff sergeant stripes, ranger tabs, and decorations that told the story of someone who had served in places that didn't appear on public maps. General Mason took the podium, his expression serious. "Ladies and gentlemen, it's time to set the record straight about some recent events on this base." He gestured toward Diana, who stood at attention near the front of the hall. "For the past 3 years, Staff Sergeant Alexandria Cross has been serving at Fort Claymore in an undercover capacity. Her mission was to assess base security, identify potential vulnerabilities, and evaluate the readiness of our personnel to handle classified information." A ripple of murmurs ran through the audience. Lieutenant Harrison felt his stomach drop as he realized the full scope of what had been happening. During her time here, Staff Sergeant Cross has identified 17 separate security breaches, prevented 2 potential intelligence leaks, and provided detailed assessments of base personnel that have been instrumental in security clearance decisions for numerous classified projects. General Mason's gaze swept the room, lingering on some of the recruits who had been part of the gossip network surrounding Diana. Our presence here was part of a larger initiative to test the security culture at military installations across the country. I'm pleased to report that Fort Claymore performed adequately. The pause before adequately made it clear that there was room for improvement. However, during the course of her mission, Staff Sergeant Cross uncovered something that went beyond routine security assessment. evidence of a cell of individuals who were actively seeking classified information about operations conducted by units that officially don't exist. Harrison felt a chill as he remembered his own investigation, his questions, his attempts to dig into classified files. These individuals weren't foreign agents or enemy operatives. They were members of our own military community who had become curious about things that were none of their business. Their curiosity led them to make inquiries that attracted the attention of people who monitor such things. Diana stepped forward, her voice carrying clearly through the hall's sound system. Yesterday's interrogation was not what it appeared to be. Those agents were not federal investigators. They were part of a security test designed to see how base personnel would react to an apparent breach of operational security. The room erupted in whispers as people tried to process this revelation. Everything they thought they knew was wrong again. The real test, Diana continued, was not whether you would discover my identity, but what you would do with that information once you had it. Would you follow proper channels? Would you maintain operational security? Would you protect classified information, even when you didn't fully understand its importance? Her gaze found Lieutenant Harrison in the crowd. I'm pleased to say that, despite some initial missteps, this base's personnel ultimately demonstrated the kind of discretion and loyalty that classified operations require. General Mason retook the podium. Staff Sergeant Cross's mission at Fort Claymore is now complete. Her assessment will be forwarded to the appropriate commands, and her recommendations will be implemented across multiple installations. He paused, his expression growing more serious. However, there is one final element to this exercise. Staff Sergeant Cross has identified individuals on this base who show the potential for specialized operations. Personnel who demonstrated the right combination of curiosity, discretion, and analytical thinking that such work requires. Harrison felt his heart rate increase as he saw Diana's slight nod in his direction. These individuals will be contacted separately for additional screening. This is an opportunity, not an obligation, but it is an opportunity that comes with significant responsibility. As the briefing concluded and personnel began filing out, Harrison found himself both relieved and terrified. Relieved that he hadn't actually compromised security or endangered anyone. Terrified by the implications of what he might be getting into. Diana approached him as he was leaving. Lieutenant, a word? They stepped aside as the crowd flowed around. Them, you handled yourself well, she said quietly. Better than most in your position would have. I feel like I've been played for the past 3 years. In a way, you have, but you were also being evaluated. The question now is whether you're interested in learning what comes next. Harrison looked at this woman who had spent 3 years hiding in plain sight, who had turned an entire military base into her personal testing ground, who had orchestrated events with the precision of a chess master. What exactly are you offering? Diana smiled the first genuine smile he had seen from her. The chance to be part of something that matters. Something that most people will never know about, but that keeps them safe nonetheless. She handed him a business card with nothing on it but a phone number. Think about it, but don't think too long. Opportunities like this don't come around very often. As she walked away, Harrison realized that his investigation into Diana Carson's background had been the most important thing he had ever done. Not because of what he had discovered, but because of what it had revealed about himself. 3 weeks later, Fort Claymore felt different. The revelation of Diana's true identity and mission had sent ripples through every aspect of base life. Conversations that once centered on weekend plans and training schedules now included hushed discussions about the nature of military service and the hidden complexities of national security. The recruits who had mocked Diana's jacket now understood what they had been seeing but failed to recognize. The patch on her sleeve wasn't just a relic from a forgotten war. It was a symbol of service that continued long after official recognition ended, of duties that extended far beyond the boundaries of conventional military structure. Marcus Reyes had been among the first to seek Diana out after the briefing. He found her in the old custodial office, packing her few personal belongings into a standard military duffel bag. "Ma'am," he said, standing at attention in the doorway, "I wanted to apologize for the things I said, the way I acted. I didn't understand." Diana looked up from her packing, her expression patient. "Reyes, isn't it?" "Yes, ma'am." "You were doing exactly what you were supposed to do, soldier. You were questioning, observing, thinking. The problem wasn't your curiosity. It was your assumption that what you saw was all there was to see." She closed the duffel bag and turned to face him. "In this business, Reyes, the most dangerous mistake you can make is thinking you understand a situation based on surface appearances. I looked like a tired old custodian, so that's what you saw. But the uniform doesn't make the soldier any more than the soldier makes the uniform. I learned that lesson, ma'am, the hard way." "Good. Lessons usually come the hard way. The easy ones don't tend to stick." Over the next few days, similar conversations took place throughout the base. Soldiers who had dismissed Diana as invisible furniture were forced to confront their own assumptions and biases. Officers who had overlooked security protocols were reminded that vigilance was a full-time responsibility, not something that could be turned on and off based on perceived threat levels. Lieutenant Harrison received a call 3 days after Diana's departure. The voice on the other end was crisp, professional, and offered him a choice that would change the trajectory of his entire career. "We have an opening in a specialized unit that requires officers with your particular combination of analytical skills and discretion. The work is classified, the assignments are unpredictable, and the recognition is non-existent. Your family and friends will think you've been assigned to routine administrative duties. Are you interested?" Harrison thought about Diana's words, about the opportunity to be part of something that mattered in ways that most people would never understand. "I'm interested." "Excellent. Report to Building 7 at Fort Beaver on Monday morning. Ask for Colonel Zane Davies, and Lieutenant, pack light. You won't be coming back to Fort Claymore." The line went dead, leaving Harrison staring at his phone and wondering what he had just committed himself to. Meanwhile, General Mason stood in his office, reviewing Diana's final assessment report. 23 pages of detailed observations, security recommendations, and personnel evaluations that would reshape how the military approached undercover operations at domestic installations. But it was the final paragraph that caught his attention. Fort Claymore's greatest vulnerability is not technological or procedural, it is cultural. Personnel at all levels have been conditioned to see military service in terms of visible hierarchy and obvious authority. They respect rank insignia and combat decorations, but struggle to recognize less conventional forms of service and sacrifice. This blind spot creates significant security risks in an era where threats increasingly come from unconventional sources. Recommendation: implement regular exercises designed to challenge assumptions about identity, authority, and the nature of military service itself. Mason closed the report and walked to his window, looking out at the training yard where new recruits were running their morning drills. They moved with precision and discipline, but he wondered how many of them would make the same mistakes as their predecessors when faced with something that didn't fit their preconceptions. A knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. Sergeant Wells from the records office stood in the doorway, holding a thick manila folder. "Sir, you asked me to pull everything we have on the Phoenix unit program." Mason took the folder, noting, "It's substantial weight. How extensive is this?" 37 installations, sir, over the past 5 years. Staff Sergeant Cross was just one of 12 operatives running similar missions across the country. Any other surprises I should know about? Wells smiled slightly. Well, sir, there's a new custodial worker starting Monday morning. Name's Johnson. Came highly recommended from the Pentagon. Mason stared at her for a long moment, then began to laugh. Of course there is. 6 months later, Lieutenant Harrison found himself in a nondescript office building in suburban Virginia, wearing civilian clothes and carrying identification. That listed his occupation as government contractor. His days were filled with briefings about operations that officially didn't exist, training for scenarios that were never supposed to happen, and preparation for assignments that would never appear on his service record. But on quiet evenings, when he had time to reflect on the path that had brought him here, he often thought about Diana Carson and the lessons she had taught him in that conference room at Fort Claymore. The most important secrets weren't hidden in classified documents or secure facilities. They were walking around in plain sight, disguised as ordinary people living ordinary lives. The real guardians of freedom weren't always the ones who got parades and medals. Sometimes they were the ones who mopped floors and emptied trash cans, who stayed invisible and asked for nothing in return except the quiet satisfaction of serving something larger than themselves. And sometimes, if you were very lucky and very observant, you might catch a glimpse of the patch on their sleeve and understand that you were in the presence of someone extraordinary masquerading as someone forgettable. Diana Carson, or Staff Sergeant Alexandria Cross, or whoever she was in her next assignment, had taught an entire military base that heroism came in many forms, and that the most effective servants of their country were often the ones you'd never suspect. In the end, that was perhaps the most valuable lesson of all. Never underestimate the person whose story you think you already know. Because in a world where secrets hide behind everyday facades, the custodian might be the most dangerous person in the room. The story of Fort Claymore became legendary within certain circles, a high, cautionary tale about assumptions and a testament to the hidden depths of human service. But for those who lived it, it remains something simpler and more profound, a reminder. That respect should be earned not by what someone appears to be, but by who they choose to become when no one is watching. And in quiet corners of military bases across the country, other custodians and cafeteria workers and maintenance staff continue their invisible service, carrying secrets that would humble the loudest heroes and protecting freedoms that most people take for granted. They ask for no recognition, no medals, no thanks. They simply show up, do their jobs, and disappear into the background of history, until the day comes when someone finally sees the patch on their sleeve and understands what it really means. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.